Back when the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Booster Course Pass was first announced, I had an idea of something big I was going to do. I'd just finished my Mario Kart wishlist prediction series, and it had become completely redundant because at no point did I ever consider the idea that 8 would get DLC, or even that we wouldn't get a new Switch Mario Kart. So I had an idea. What if, when this was all over, and we had all 96 courses in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, I did a ranking of every single course. Not just a tier list, but a full ranking from number 96 to number 1. It would be a way for me to still get some meaningful content out of Mario Kart with an idea that I felt was incredibly novel and unique. Of course, when the time came around, everyone had that unique and novel idea, and I, as a YouTuber of barely 100 subscribers, resigned myself to the fact that it wasn't worth it. While I feel my opinions certainly go against the grain the majority of the time, I have a heavy dislike for talking about topics that are talked to death by other people. I hate feeling like I'm just an echo for someone else, and I typically prefer to do something if I think I can add something unique or bring up an idea that no one else or few people would do. A few ideas popped into my head, such as talking about every course without ranking them, or ranking the music for every course, but nothing felt worth pursuing. Until I remembered that I love this game so much, but I also think that most of the courses are pretty flawed in how they're built. Many of the things that people love about certain courses, I just don't like. I have heavy reservations about 90% of the anti-gravity used in this game, and I think the visual style is a massive clash between the super realistic style of the base game and the incredibly basic BCP graphics, with neither style actually working. As a result, I have a laundry list of changes I would potentially make to the courses in the game if I had the chance, and I feel like this is something I could easily talk about. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through every course and give at least one alteration I would make to the course to improve it. Any course that I feel could get multiple changes, I'll give those changes, but I can't change it too heavily. It still has to be recognisable. I'll try not to alter layouts too heavily, although I will detail some slight changes if that is necessary, and I can't fundamentally change the theming either. This is trying to improve on what we already have, not make a new version of an old course, unrelated to what 8 has done. So without further ado, let's get into it. We'll start with the first course, Mario Kart Stadium, and I know it's meant to be a starter course, but I've always detested this as an introduction to anti-gravity. The issue with it is that it doesn't convey anti-gravity effectively at all. The actual shift to anti-gravity is far too gradual to actually be particularly noticeable, and the fact that the path is just made up of road that, for some reason, suddenly goes perpendicular doesn't help. I've always felt that the trick to anti-gravity that makes it work is that it has to make you feel like you're going anti-gravity while you're in the process of it, and you also need to make the path something tangible that someone will recognise as being kinda weird to drive on. Fortunately, I have a solution to Mario Kart Stadium that addresses both of these issues. Instead of the road itself being a gradual shift into anti-gravity, you would drive towards a giant screen. This screen would be standing on two legs, and you would drive up one leg, then do a U-turn on the screen itself before driving down the second leg. This solves the issue in two ways. Firstly, the legs would create a much less gradual change to the anti-gravity, meaning that while you're actually going vertical, it actually feels like it. Plus, it being a screen is important. We all know that giant TV screens like this in real life are vertical, so having one that you can drive on much better conveys the fact that you are, in fact, driving vertically. The screen also fits the stadium theme pretty well. This would take it from a rather uninteresting course to a pretty awesome one and a perfect introduction to anti-gravity. Water Park suffers a very similar issue. The change to anti-gravity is way too gradual, and while you're supposed to be driving on a theme park ride, it literally just looks like the road. I would say the best solution is to make that part a full-on loop-the-loop. For some reason, there aren't any loop-the-loops in Mario Kart 8, despite them being perfect for a game with anti-gravity. Well, a theme park is literally the perfect place for it. Maybe make the road less wide too. It has no reason to be as wide as it is, even as a Mushroom Cup course. Next is Sweet Sweet Canyon. I like this one, but the biggest issue is with how it looks. The colours are far too muted. This course is supposed to look like delicious, sweet treats, but for that I would expect more bright colours. I want to feel like I'm driving through a French patisserie, not a land of beige. Make the colours pop more with more brightly coloured icing, and for the love of God, make the water look less like urine. Then there's Thwomp Ruins. This took me a while to think of, but the biggest issue here, for me at least, is the last anti-gravity section, which has no reason to be anti-gravity because it's basically just a slightly tilted road. Now, this itself is evidence for anti-gravity being a poorly handled mechanic, as it happens in a lot of courses, but in many of those I wouldn't necessarily say that taking away or changing the anti-gravity solves anything. I would, however, say that something can be done here. Keep the general layout of the section, but instead of it being solid ground, have the section be an elevated wall section. Think of it this way, these ruins are old and probably crumbling thanks to them being smashed by many thwomps, so it's more than feasible that a part of the ruins, particularly one that would be over a large canyon or abyss, would have its floor collapse. So this section of the course could take the same general path, but as the floor has fallen away, it would instead have a wall section that you would be required to go onto to progress. This just makes more effective use of the anti-gravity here. Then we have 8's own Mario circuit. This was a nice idea, utilising the Mobius strip for a unique layout, but it simply doesn't come across very well that you're perpendicular or even upside down, or that other drivers are racing right under you. My solution would be to add portions of the track that have glass floor. The reason for this is that it would allow you to actually see the drivers that are on the other side of the Mobius strip, which would be a really awesome effect and would much better sell the anti-gravity. Yeah, at this point you might be able to guess that many of my issues are gonna be related to anti-gravity because it's a pretty significant issue I have with many of these courses, especially the Nitros from base 8. With that said, I don't have any issues with the anti-gravity in Toad Harbor, and, in fact, I feel it's one of the stronger anti-gravity offerings. But the course itself is kinda generic to me, and I feel like it would have helped this course to stray away from the more realistic setting it went for, and instead make this feel like a Toad Harbor. The buildings could have had much more Toad House inspired designs, and I think this would have been to its strength. Twisted Mansion is another one that feels quite generic, and I could probably tweak quite a bit about it, but I think the biggest issue is that the music goes for a big, bombastic style that kinda clashes with and undermines what is meant to be a spooky course. I could kinda understand it if it was going all in on being a creepy madhouse type deal, but the underwater section seems far too spooky to work with that. So I think toning the music down a notch or three would help maintain a more consistent and effective atmosphere. Not sure how much this would help the course, but it would do something for sure. Shy Guy Falls has possibly my favourite use of anti-gravity in the entire game, as the waterfall makes for an incredibly unique section both visually and gameplay wise. I do feel, however, that every part of the course that isn't on the waterfall is pretty bland. Adding some Shy Guys with their pickaxes as obstacles towards the end of the course would help make that section a bit more interesting. Now we get to the Star Cup, and I'm of the pretty controversial opinion that this might be the worst cup in the game. 3 of the 4 courses I do not get the hype for, and Sunshine Airport might be the worst offender. It's literally just an airport, but it doesn't take advantage of that setting at all. So the first thing we're changing is actually having some interaction with the planes. In the course we have one plane you drive through, but that is the only direct interaction we have, and it's a glorified tunnel. I think being able to actually drive briefly atop one might be cool, and having planes on the actual runway that can run you over as they try to take off could be a great idea. Other than this, it needs to be revamped visually. They seem to be going for a very realistic look for the airport, but this feels super out of place in the Mario game. So I think the actual theming should be based upon the general architecture of Isle Delfino. The course is called Sunshine Airport, so having a solid link to Isle Delfino would be awesome and make this fit into the universe much better. Dolphin Shoal's biggest issue for me is the pipe section. It feels really awkward and I never really know where it is I should be aiming for, but it also feels way too easy. If I miss 1 or even 2 pipes, it doesn't seem to stop me getting to the end of that section, so the whole thing feels both useless and unsatisfying. I want it to feel more like Mushroom Gorge, where you know that missing a single mushroom means you're toast. I'd make the airstreams from the pipes a bit more obvious, but I'd also make them a little more punishing. If you miss a pipe, you should actually get punished for it, probably by falling down. This is probably mainly an issue with the floatiness of underwater, but I feel like that section could benefit from both clarity and increased challenge. Then there's Electrodrome. I don't personally like the vibe, but that isn't a fault of the track itself. What is a little more tangibly problematic is the fact that the course spends way too long as a split path. Split paths are one of my least favourite elements of 8's general design. Splitting the path into two is a neat gimmick for a couple of courses, but in general it actually isn't good for races. After all, if you split all the races up, that means less interaction with other players, and therefore those sections become far less interesting. As I say, if they only did this in 1 or 2 courses, it would be fine, but it's overused to excess here, and Electrodrome is by far the worst contender because its split section is so long. One way to remedy this would be to have the 2 paths cross over at points. Make them more intertwined so the races can swap paths at various points. This would not only make the section feel more unique, but it would make it more interesting because it isn't denying the player of interactions from half the opponents. For me personally, Mount Wario is the one saving grace of the Star Cup. An absolutely killer course that pulls off almost everything perfectly. Finding fault in this one was tough, but I think addressing probably the least interesting section would be good. The slalom. The slalom is a purely aesthetic feature and has no gameplay function. Well, let's change that. The flags would give you a speed boost if you actually managed to go through them, but they would also be a physical feature of the course. The player could pass through them, but items like shells would bounce off them. This would give this section something a bit more about it. Next is Cloudtop Cruise. I don't think I have particularly strong feelings towards this one, but it doesn't really do much wrong. If anything, I would probably make it so that more of the course takes place on actual airships, as currently the airship section is kind of brief and barely really worth it at all. Bone Dry Dunes, meanwhile, is fairly disliked in the community in general, but I think it catches quite a bit more slack than it deserves. That's not to say I particularly like it, but I think it being a bit bland is the worst of its crimes. Yeah, it somehow manages to be bland despite having a very unique sand ocean concept. That idea goes almost completely unnoticed though, as it's all background. A solution I thought of would be if at some point there's a shortcut that involves a sand ship. These are in the background but never actually interact with the player other than to throw coins out. Well, having a short route where you can actually go onto one of these would be a perfect way to solidify the concept. I have a lot of love for 8's rendition of the Bowser Castle, but I have one slight gripe. There is, for some reason, not hide nor hair of thwomps. It's not even as if they didn't have thwomps in the game, they have their own course, but there aren't any in the one place you would expect them. Well, I feel like a few thwomps at various points in this one would be excellent. And then we get to Wii U's Rainbow Road. My least favourite Rainbow Road ever, and what I considered for a while my least favourite course in the franchise. The issues with this one are pretty fundamental honestly, but an easier fix would just be to make it more colourful. The colours of this one are muted to a ridiculous degree and I hate it. And actually, make the space station part rainbow coloured too. I have no idea why modern rainbow roads are so afraid to be rainbows, but I would love for them to actually stick to the theme. On to the retro courses, and we start with Moo Moo Meadows, and this is a hard one to improve because they did really well with it. If you pushed me, I would say give it a daytime skybox. Sure, sunsets generally look quite nice, but I feel like it doesn't need to be used everywhere, and I actually miss the bright daytime feel of the original Moo Moo Meadows. Then there's GBA Mario Circuit, and well, I have to say I'm not a fan of the anti-gravity of this course. It's just uphill. I don't get why it has to be anti-gravity. I guess I wouldn't take it away, but I would make it a more drastic angle to the ground. Maybe not entirely vertical, but enough to make it feel worth having anti-gravity there at all. Also, the music. They decided for some reason to remake the beta version of the GBA music rather than the actual version that appears in the game, and it just does not have the same jazz energy, so I would absolutely remake the music to be much more similar to the original. Cheep Cheep Beach I don't find all that interesting, but I also don't know what I would improve because the course itself is just fine. No obvious flaws. I'd probably have more Cheep Cheeps in the underwater section and call it a day. Then there's Toad's Turnpike, and I would probably take away the trees from the background. The original had such a specific vibe that the remake really lacks. It's hard to explain, but the course being entirely walled by a massive metal barrier and the bright red sunset, I don't know, I just love that vibe. The remake doesn't feel like it has any of that, and it does feel a bit more generic. The trees probably make it feel much less oppressive than the original, so I'd get rid of them and make it just walled in. Maybe add some cliffs instead. And of course make the course a sunset again. Now, Dry Dry Desert is interesting. Most people take issue with the fact it has an oasis because it conflicts with the dry aspect, but Does it really? Sure, an oasis is the opposite of dry, but you also only find oases in the driest of places. That's the entire point of them. If you find them in somewhere less dry, that's just a pond. So no, the oasis stays. It makes a pretty uninteresting section in the original have something about it. Instead, I would add in the tornadoes. Losing these was an absolute travesty. And that goes for the piranha plant in the sandpit too. They removed it because Larky 2 is much quicker to put players back on the track now. But with Wii Rainbow Road, they showed that getting more creative with how players are animated falling off is not out of the question. So having the plant swallow the player and Larky 2 fishing them out does not feel unworkable. Donut Plains 3 is generally not my favourite aesthetically. The realistic style they've given it makes the course feel more underwhelming, but my changes would actually be in just giving it more elevation. They did have some change in elevation due to the underwater parts, but I still feel that a few hills or something would help this course. As for Royal Raceway, while it's not a favourite of mine, I think the main crime it commits is taking away the path to the castle. They should absolutely have made the path to it more hidden so that players would not get confused, but taking it away entirely was a crime. My idea would be that there would be a lake of some sort, on the other side of which would be Peach's castle, and you can actually go into the water and come out the other side. It was always such a cool Easter egg. DK Jungle is pretty faithful to both the original and to Donkey Kong Country Returns, which it's based on. But again, the anti-gravity in the Banana Temple feels so incredibly redundant, and I hate it. If only there was some way to make this anti-gravity section shaped like a U-turn in a temple themed around bananas more interesting, worth being anti-gravity, and thematically relevant. Oh yeah, there is. Make it a giant banana you have to drive on. As well as this, I'd actually probably give it the Yoshi's Island treatment as well. As in, change coins on the course to the banana coins from Donkey Kong Country. Also, give it a unique starting and ending theme. While it isn't actually a crossover course, neither is Yoshi's Island, but like that course, it feels like it's absolutely perfect to actually be given that crossover treatment. For Wario Stadium, I would literally just take the anti-gravity section away. It's both super unnecessary and doesn't fit into the course at all. A straight up dirt track course can work really well, and I wish they just tried to focus on that rather than trying to force anti-gravity in places it simply doesn't fit. I have a lot of love for Sherbet Land, mainly because the vibe it has is so cozy, but I just cannot get behind the way they changed the freezies. In the game as is, the freezies just spin you out. In the original, they would actually freeze you, which would make you slide in the direction you were going, and that's a really cool and unique mechanic. 8 really did sanitize so much about your interactions with both items and course elements, and that's a crying shame, so this is the change I would make. Other than giving Melody Motorway its much better PAL name in all countries, and thus meaning we don't have to see Music Park on the flags in this course, finding things to improve is really difficult. They kinda knocked it out of the park with the course in its original form, and they changed almost nothing on remaking it. The one nitpick I would possibly have is the music. I think this is an unpopular opinion, but for a course based around music, the actual music here isn't that good. The melody itself feels just kind of brain dead, so I think making that a bit more interesting would be my change here. Yoshi Valley also does what it does really well, to the point that the best change I could think to make would be just generally making all the paths feel more equal in terms of length. The issue with this course is that after the first few times, you'll figure out the best path to go and do that. Making the paths more equal would partially help this, but it would also be cool to try and incentivize taking different paths. One idea I had for this was for item boxes to only be on certain paths at certain points, and maybe there are signs which would tell you whether there are item boxes on it at any given point. That way, you could make the decision of which paths to go and not just go the same way every time. Tick-Tock Clock is another course that really doesn't have much wrong with it, but I would take away the gliding section. Gliding in general doesn't feel that interesting to me as is, unless used for shortcuts and stuff, so the use in Tick-Tock Clock doesn't really inspire anything in me. What is much more interesting here is the gear section below, and I just think that focusing on that for this section is a better choice. Piranha Plant Pipeway is the biggest roadblock so far because I have a lot of love for this course, and that makes it difficult to find flaws in it. But now I think of it, the anti-gravity section feels much less iconic than the version in 7. If I were improving this course, I would make that anti-gravity section much more similar aesthetically to how it was in 7, including being much more enclosed, but still keeping it as an anti-gravity section. Not that I like it as an anti-gravity section or think it needs to be, but I can't say that taking that away would improve the track any. Grumble Volcano is once again tough to actively improve. One cool change would be if the ceiling of the inside of the volcano would fall away, just as the ground does, and this could create chunks of rock that you would have to dodge. This may end up being a little tricky though, given how narrow that section is, so maybe if it was a bit wider it would work better. Or maybe the chunks of rock could form ramps instead. N64 Rainbow Road has arguably the most obvious change possible. Make it 2 laps. This was an absolute monster of a course in its original state, the longest course in the game and without anywhere to fall off either. Thankfully they improved almost everything about it, and they even made the course shorter by making it a sectioned course. Except they ended up going in the complete opposite direction and ended up making it way too short. It just doesn't feel like it's barely gotten started and then it's over. 2 laps would be the perfect length. Oh, and another change. I would make the road just a smidge narrower. This iteration of the course is definitely not as easy as the version with walls around the entire thing, but it still ranks as one of the easier Rainbow Roads by far, and I think a part of that is down to the fact that the turns aren't tricky enough for how wide the course is. Now we are at the original Wii U DLC, and while Yoshi Circuit is certainly great, the fact that they got rid of the Yoshi Copter is unacceptable and it must be reinstated. And while we're bringing back old Yoshi Circuit content, might as well bring back the underground shortcut. No idea why they ever got rid of it. It's awesome and heck, could have been cool to see as an anti-gravity shortcut of some sort. Excite Bike Arena is a pretty tricky one because its simplicity is a part of what makes it such a cool Excite Bike reference. The turns feel very underwhelming to me most of the time because there simply isn't much going on with them. The mud patches are a nice start, but they're so small that you can almost always just hug the corner and you'll be fine. Making the mud patches bigger would make it more likely that you have to go wider with your turn, as well as having more to have to avoid for those times when you are forced to. Dragon Driftway has so much potential, and it lived up to some of that, but it ended up feeling a little underwhelming somehow. There really isn't much to see, and so I think introducing some sort of hazard would be cool, and seeing as this course is based on Gobblegut, that would be the perfect place to start. Gobblegut's battle in Galaxy 2 has you bursting the bellyache bulges on his body, so why not include these? They could be red bulges that you trick off, but a second after you've tricked off them, they would make a small explosion which would hurt anyone passing by. It would add at least something to a course that is way too bland for what it is. For Mute City, I would absolutely take away the walls from the corkscrew section. I think this course feels really underwhelming when compared to Big Blue, and the amount of railings does not help this, but that section specifically I think could have benefited from having an ability to fall off. Adds a bit of danger and excitement. I would also make the walls take away coins from you when you hit them. Walls in F-Zero are dangerous, but this isn't translated into the Mario Kart courses at all, other than visually. For Wario's Gold Mine, we would be righting the most obvious wrong that was done to this track. Make the minecarts dangerous again. It can stay anti-gravity if you like, but those minecarts should not give you a spin boost. They should be an obstacle capable of flinging you off the course. Of course, knockback from anything has been significantly reduced in 8 anyway, but just making them a hazard again would be an improvement enough. I'm really splitting hairs with SNES Rainbow Road, as I think everything it does pretty well. I'll say maybe a couple more ramps around the place, just to fill some of the emptier stretches. For Ice Ice Outpost, I get what they were going for, but I think it's a bit weird that a course called Ice Ice Outpost has a surprising lack of actual ice to drive on. Some sections, such as the beginning section and the part inside the ice cave, I would make actual ice sections, but most of the rest is alright, if not amazing. Hyrule Circuit I think is missing something that would make it truly feel like a Zelda course. It has no Zelda characters. This is meant to be Hyrule, but it doesn't exactly look like any specific version. Having Zelda, Tingle, Beedle, Impa, and any number of characters on the sidelines cheering, like the Animal Crossing course, would have been awesome. Baby Park is so incredibly simple that I would imagine it's tough for many to imagine what changes could be made to improve it without fundamentally undermining what it is. I, however, have a very good idea of what change can be done, or rather, undone. Anti-gravity. This is the one situation where I genuinely believe that a course having anti-gravity is an issue of which the solution is outright getting rid of it. Baby Park is built to be Mania Incarnate, and that manifests in many ways, but one of those ways is being able to bash into people. With anti-gravity, bashing into people gives both players a speed boost, and it just isn't as satisfying to do compared to slamming someone into a waiting banana peel. Baby Park is fun regardless, but this change would make it even more fun. And it's not like the anti-gravity is in any way necessary. it subscribes to the all too common idea of making slightly tilted roads anti-gravity sections, which I always find silly. My favourite course in the entire franchise is Cheeseland, and I adore the 8 version, but that does not mean that I don't have reservations about it. It made a few changes, mostly aesthetically, that I would absolutely change back. The sky should be darker and more space-like, while not necessarily being pitch black, and get that planet back in the sky. I also think the cheese structures in the background of the original were more interesting than anything the remake did, so going back to that would be beneficial. Finally, bring back the mousers. I don't hate the chomps being added, but the mousers fit the course so well and I wish they'd returned. I've been thinking about it, and Wild Woods is fantastic, but it suffers from an issue that many courses that use anti-gravity prominently have. Most of the time, it's hard to actually tell that you're even in anti-gravity. There are telltale signs, but it isn't communicated super well. My change would be to make the tree here a weeping willow. Weeping willows famously droop downwards, so seeing the leaves going what looks like horizontally above you would much better convey that you're on the side of a tree, and it's easier to see more often on the course. Half the issue with anti-gravity is just lack of clarity. Animal Crossing is a great love letter to Animal Crossing, but a little uninspired in terms of layout. Not that I can see any easy way to fix that. So I'll just focus on enhancing the Animal Crossing side, and a thought I had was having slight alterations to the course on certain times of the year. For example, on Christmas, Jingle the Reindeer would be on the sidelines, or on Halloween there would be pumpkins as decorations. These would ultimately be the same as the variant of the season they appear in, but those variants would be the only one that could appear on that day. Cooper City has one part I really hate, the S-bend. It just feels kinda obnoxious and unnecessarily hard to manoeuvre. I wouldn't remove it altogether, but I would make it less drastic of a bend, just to take the edge off and not make it feel so daunting. Now, Ribbon Road. This will need some explaining. This might be my most hated individual course in the franchise, this specific version. The reason is because Super Circuit is a very special game to me, and I feel very strongly about its courses, especially when they're remade. 8's version of Ribbon Road is an absolute abomination of an adaptation. It takes a general concept, twists it just far enough to be barely recognisable, and then proceeds to remove any and all visual elements of the original. What it does incredibly well. But it isn't Ribbon Road, and it's so frustrating because of all the courses, Ribbon Road had some of the greatest potential based on its original concept. This was the one course that didn't need to change, and because they did change it, we will never get a true remake of Ribbon Road. They would have been better off making what we got as Ribbon Road a Nitro. But if I want to fix this, I can't change the layout or the general theming. So what can I do? Well, plenty. Firstly, keep the ribbon red the entire way round. Ignoring the fact that red is the best and most iconic colour for a ribbon, the red ribbon with yellow detailing of the original was a massive part of what made the course's visual identity so strong. And while I get why they changed it up, I still think it would be stronger visually if they had not done that. Next, the wallpaper in the room absolutely should have been blue with white clouds, and I don't get how they failed to do that. It's a simple way to make the course feel like Ribbon Road while still getting the new theming. And, maybe predictably, the floor being blue carpet would also really help make the course feel like it originally did. Nothing else about the course would have to change. To be clear, my ideal change would be to change the course's name. Toy Time Panic, or Bedroom Blast, or Gift Raceway, or even Ribbon Road, just not GBA Ribbon Road. Making this a Nitro course is absolutely the best change that could be made because it still allows for Ribbon Road to actually get adapted into a modern game, which will now never happen. But seeing as that wasn't in the spirit of what I'm doing here, I decided to get more creative with solutions here. Only thing I'm sad I couldn't add were the pillars, but in order to do that I feel I would have to take it out of the bedroom, and while I'm personally happy for that to be the case, again, I just don't feel it sticks with the spirit of this challenge. For Super Bell Subway, again, very difficult. This is basically a good version of what a transport-based course should look like. Sunshine Airport, take notes. I would maybe brighten up the area around the starting line a bit. That whole section is kinda devoid of colour, and I think it could use it. Big Blue is like Mute City, but good. And my change here would be one of the changes I made to Mute City. Make the barriers steal coins from you. I just think this would really add something to make these courses feel even more unique. We've hit the halfway mark and we're onto the BCP and Paris Promenade. Now, many of these could probably do with a texture update, but I genuinely feel like the visual style isn't that bad a lot of the time. Paris Promenade is mostly really solid with its visual style, but I would make the grass more textured than it is. Honestly, this is a cop-out because I actually like everything else the course does, but the BCP does give me plenty of grounds to use that cop-out if I need it. Toad Circuit is going to get a change in its visuals too, but not texturing. I couldn't care less about the texture here. What I'm less fond of is the shade of green that grass is. It's hideous, and I would get rid of it immediately. Darken that grass and be done with it. For Choco Mountain, I would get rid of the gliding section. Gliding is a mechanic I find very uninteresting. In reality, all it does is make you able to go up and down, but takes away almost any danger from items and essentially forces you to travel in basically a straight line. Most of the time, I find it inoffensive enough to not care about removing it, but I don't know, I think here a whole rickety bridge would have been more interesting. I am a lot less harsh on the remake of Coconut Mall than everyone else, mainly because I acknowledge that it is ultimately still Coconut Mall, and by virtue of that is awesome. I also love the splashes of bright colours they've put everywhere. It is truly the most vibrant version of Coconut Mall. But yeah, the cars need to move back and forth again. I don't mind the donuts, but they're really easy to avoid, and that section could do with a bit more difficulty. And while we're at it, bring back the thanks for visiting sign. That was always a lot of fun. Tokyo Blur is hard to improve, partially because a lot of the issue is just that they don't do anything that interesting, and it doesn't feel like it uses any landmarks. Now, I'm no Tokyo landmark expert, so I can't comment on that, but I do feel like the course has many fairly empty feeling sections, and maybe some Goombas would make it feel more interesting. For Shroom Ridge, the solution is to reintroduce two-way traffic. This alone would just increase the difficulty a bit and make it feel less of a pushover course. Sky Garden is another tough pill to swallow as a Super Circuit fanboy, and while I was never as into this as Ribbon Road, it still hurts to see what they did to it. There's no helping what they did to the layout, but the visuals can be fixed. The cobbles for a start should go back to their original green colour. It was so iconic, changing it made no sense. Getting the Luigi blimp back is also a must. Ninja Hideaway I fell in love with immediately, which is impressive seeing as I was ready to hate everything that Tour did. Little did I know. However, that last turn is really awkward and feels like it isn't well optimised for 8 Deluxe. Tweaking it to make it, I don't know, wider or less sudden a turn would make it feel much better. New York Minute is another one that isn't very good, but the issues are far too deep-rooted to be easily fixable. However, I guess having the cars actually move would be a good start. As it is, they don't really add much to the course, so I think adding a dynamic element to them would help add a little more interest into it. Also, add more landmarks in more prominent ways. The Empire State Building is just kinda there. I barely even realise it's there at all, honestly, and there's no Statue of Liberty. Obviously the geography makes that a bit difficult, but it just feels weird for those two iconic parts of New York to be either absent or feel absent. I've always had a deep hatred for SNES Mario Circuit 3, owing mostly to the fact that I just did not enjoy it on Wii. So I'm as shocked as anyone that I actually respect the decision to make this remake the way they did. I think the first course ever created for Mario Kart being practically untouched in the most modern game is kind of a stroke of genius, with a caveat being that I don't think they went far enough. Hear me out, what if they made it look exactly like it did on the SNES? As in, full pixel graphics, the background, the course itself, the walls, the pipes, all of it. It's kinda out there, but I think this would be the best way to do what they were trying to do, and it would make it an incredibly unique course. My desire for Calamari Desert is simple. Make the red platform that appears on lap 2 to put you onto the alternate path actually look like it belongs in Calamari Desert. They essentially took the platforms from Tour's Trick variants and plopped one in the middle of the Wild West, and it clashes heavily. Make it look like a rickety old wooden platform, as is fitting of the course. As someone who's never played much of DS or 7, Waluigi Pinball has never been a particular favourite of mine, but the 8 Deluxe version made me realise just why it's so well loved. And as is, there really isn't much to criticise, except the music. This is the only course in the entire game that has music in it that is already used on another course, and that just really upsets a deep part of me that hates a rule being broken once and only once. But it isn't just that. The version of the music made specifically for Wario Stadium doesn't actually fit Waluigi Pinball all that well. It has much more of a rock vibe, whereas Waluigi Pinball works much better with a more electronic sound. So having a version of the music that is similar to Wario Stadium, but just feels more fitting to the arcade vibe would be the best way to improve this track. When I first played Sydney Sprint, I really liked it, but over time I do feel I've become more lukewarm towards it. And that's maybe because it's kinda generic most of the time. Any course that spends too much time in the regular streets of the city is destined to feel kinda bland. That said, the Sydney Opera House is a clear standout section of this course, and I think it would have been cool to actually have a section where you go on top of it. Could have been a cool anti-gravity section with some tricking potential. Snowland, in my opinion, is a pretty flawless recreation of a GBA course, something we don't always get, but I will say that not having some sort of adaptation of the massive shortcut in this course kinda sucks. I could imagine it being an underground shortcut of sorts, guided by a piranha plant cutout. My wish for Mushroom Gorge has always been the same. Bring back the original mushrooms. The mushrooms in the original game almost felt like they had a slight lip to the edge, or maybe a bump in the middle, and the ones in 7 onwards are just much more boring in shape. This kind of thing is such a tiny deal, but it just feels less satisfying to use the mushrooms in 8. Sky High Sundae had the most insane heel turn from the fans, of being incredibly hyped when it was revealed, and then hating it like it was the worst thing in the world when it was released, and yeah, it does kinda suck. It's better in Tour, where the emphasis is different, but that unfortunately doesn't help much here, as the issues are too fundamental. So if there's one good change I can make, it would be for the railings to not give you anti-gravity boost and instead be a solid object. Seriously, why did they do that? It makes no sense. I was so bitterly disappointed at London Loop, as a Brit myself. I don't live in London itself, but I've visited many times, and it just kinda sucked that the only landmark with any impact on the race was the Tower Bridge. Nelson's Column could have been an obstacle. Gliding past the London Eye would have been really interesting. Just anything. Boo Lake is another nigh-perfect GBA remake, and this was something of a wish fulfillment for me. A few years ago I saw a fan-made remake of Broken Pier, which went underwater, and I thought it would be the most amazing thing for them to do officially, but they never would. So you can imagine, when I actually saw that they had done this with Boo Lake, it felt insane to me. My one criticism would be the fact that it would work even better if the whole thing looked a bit more broken. I want to get the vibe that we're on something that is so old and abandoned, it is just broken and falling into the water. But as is, it feels like it's been built this way. The other change I would make is bringing back the property of the sides of the course falling away if you hit them. This was always a really cool thing to have in the course. I will say now that I've never minded the more cartoony look they went for with Alpine Pass's rocks. I think it can work really well if done right, and certainly better than the dull grey with muddy textures that the 3DS version has. I'll also say that just a little bit of texturing would make it look better though. This is absolutely a cop-out, but I've got to take what I can. Maple Tree Way is my second favourite course in the franchise overall, and this version is almost the perfect version. Almost. For how gorgeous they made Maple Tree Way in 8, not having the bridge and instead having a rather dull gliding section will always feel like a downgrade. I also don't really like the green moss on the trees. It really clashes with the overall colour scheme in a way that never felt right to me, but my biggest gripe is with the music. This, to me, is one of the most iconic parts of the course, and it feels like they suck so much of the energy from it. It never hits the highs that the Wii version hits when the drums come in, and I just wish I could say that the 8 remix was the ultimate remix of Maple Tree Way, but it just feels like it lacks something. Berlin Byways is another course that just kinda looks generic, and I think a part of the issue is that it mostly just looks so beige. What Berlin Byways needs is just a splash of colour to mix things up a bit and make it feel less generic. Peach Gardens having a backwards section was fantastic, no notes on that, but it's true that they simplified things with the layout of the flower beds, and I think keeping the original layouts here would have made it better, even if it may have needed some adjusting to account for the backwards lap. Merry Mountain is a pretty fun idea, but I'll also say that the layout is rather simple, and I may have added at least another section of railway track just to give it a little extra spice. And then we come to 3DS Rainbow Road. I've never been a fan of this one, both because it feels like it de-emphasises the rainbow side of Rainbow Road in favour of a space theme, and also because it's far too gimmicky. I don't think a Rainbow Road really does its job at being the biggest challenge of your skills when all it's throwing at you is gimmicks. These issues are pretty fundamental, so changing them for this challenge isn't going to work. What I can do is go the opposite direction and make it more space themed. I think part of the issue is that if you aren't going to make this a proper Rainbow Road, at least stick to the bit. The perfect example is the Rainbow Mushroom. This thing looks out of place no matter what way you slice it, so I think replacing it with a planet you can bounce on would at least make the space thing feel a bit more integrated. For Amsterdam Drift, I think the tulip fields are a nice visual change of pace, but I don't feel like they make particularly good use of it in any way other than visual, so maybe having a couple of gaps in the fence where you could cut through would be good. For Riverside Park, it is again splitting hairs because of how good it is as a remake, but I feel like more of the piranha plants should be blowing items above them. It's a cool mechanic, but most of them don't have anything above them, and without that they're a fairly standard obstacle. DK Snowboard Cross is another really tough one, as they adapted it practically perfectly in my opinion, so I'll use the cop-out answer and say that the wooden part of the track could do with a bit more texturing to make it actually look like wood. Yoshi's Island is also quite fantastic, but I think they could have gone further in the reference to Yoshi's Island by making everything look like it has that iconic black outline style. It would probably be difficult to technically pull off, but it would have been awesome. Bangkok Rush has a very easy answer. Bring back the Inky Piranha plant. It was a cool and unique part of the original version, and there really doesn't seem to be a reason to miss it out. It's not as if adding a new type of piranha plant was that big a deal. This very wave introduced fire piranha plants in DS Mario Circuit, so it should have been very possible. And speaking of, let's talk about DS Mario Circuit. I think this might be my favourite Mario Circuit ever, honestly, but I've always felt like the Wiggler appears way too late in the race, not coming along until lap 3. I think appearing in lap 2 would be much better. I have a theory that the next Mario Kart game will have a course creator, which partially comes from the fact that the RMX courses feel like they were made with a resource like that in mind, but also the fact that in Tour, the piranha plant cutouts are in their normal positions in Waluigi Stadium, but are repositioned in some of the challenges involved in the course. It feels like there must be some tool that makes moving things around much easier, and the Switch version of the course backs this up by putting the cutouts in yet another different position, with the first set being angled upwards. As interesting as I think the implications are, the cutouts should absolutely be put back in their normal positions. And now we come to the nigh impossible one. Despite Maple Tree Way and Cheeseland being my two favourite courses in the franchise as a whole, if we are just isolating the 8 versions of the courses, then Singapore Speedway is my favourite. Listening to the music for all the tour courses after the BCP was announced, Singapore and LA were the courses whose music captivated me the most. They are what pushed me to want to play Tour, and it was here that I fell in love with Singapore Speedway as a course too. And then it came to Deluxe and was adapted perfectly. So finding a way to improve it is almost impossible for me. It has to be general texturing. Don't get me wrong, the course is gorgeous as it is, but in terms of gameplay I literally cannot fault it. The textures are far from a deal breaker, but it's about the only thing I could possibly think to change here. And let's do that to Athens Dash too. I'm not as enamoured with it as I am Singapore, but I still adore Athens Dash. But it has to be said, the houses in the background look terrible. It's not a deal breaker, but it would be nice for them to look a bit more real. This may be controversial, but for Daisy Cruiser, I would actually want them to revert the lower deck section back to being a non-underwater section. I've never quite seen the point of it, as it just clashes entirely with the rest of the course and the theming in general. It meaning to be an aquarium is an okay explanation, but it isn't clearly conveyed in that case, and it still doesn't work for me. Is an aquarium on a boat a normal thing? Either way, I just think there were other ways to make the lower deck section interesting, and this just never worked for me. For Moonview Highway, it's the traffic. There needs to be more of it. The course is just so much easier than it used to be, and thus a lot less interesting, and it feels like it needs just a few more cars to make it feel satisfying weaving through them. For Squeaky Clean Sprint, there's one bit I don't understand. On one of the alternate routes, there's a mushroom that you bounce off of. Why the heck is there a mushroom there? It doesn't fit thematically at all. Changing that to be, I don't know, a sponge or even a rubber duck would make this feel much less out of place. Los Angeles Laps took me no time to think about. The music. The original music is very divisive, but it's also incredibly unique, and I think greater pains should have been taken to actually replicate its style rather than making it generic sax solo number 72. And then there's the infamous Sunset Wilds, and yeah, the sunset absolutely needs to return. That is one of the most unique aspects of Sunset Wilds, one of the things that makes it stand out, and losing that sucks. But it isn't the only thing that made it original. No, back in the day the Shy Guys were more than just a regular obstacle. If you ran into them, they would latch onto you and slow you down while also taking coins away from you. Now, their potentially offensive Native American get-ups certainly shouldn't return, but that mechanic would be really cool to have back. Even if that's hard to work with, what if when you run into a Shy Guy it gets flung onto the screen? where it will cover up your view like a blooper. The two actually interesting things about Sunset Wilds were taken away, and I cannot get my head around why neither of them was worked in somehow. For Cooper Cape, it's the pipe. The one thing that sucks most about the introduction of gliding, underwater and anti-gravity is the fact that they have decided to force it into retro courses even when it doesn't fit. The underwater pipe no longer being an underwater pipe makes no sense, and the zappers made for a really interesting dynamic in that section. Making that section as it once was is such a logical change to make. Vancouver Velocity is interesting as a city course, as it's also a snow course, with the issue I have being that it barely even has any snow. It just has a bit of the size for a single section, and I feel like they could have done so much more, added more snow. The biggest issue with this course is that it visually looks a lot like New York Minute a lot of the time, and more snow would have made it stand out more. Then comes Rome Avanti, a course I came to really love in A after not really caring for it in Tour. I think it works as a nighttime course, but I don't think the music fits it as a nighttime course, so I would alter the music just a bit so that it fits the vibe a bit more. DK Mountain is an amazing remake to me. However, I will say that I would have liked it if the bridge wasn't constantly waving. I liked how before it would tilt based on the player's weight on it, and I think that section would have been slightly better for keeping this quality. For Daisy Circuit, I would get rid of the piranha plant cutout at the stairs shortcut. This shortcut already has off-road, so there's no reason to telegraph that it's there quite so hard. It was a really cool secret route in Wii, and now it's just not a secret, and that sucks. For Piranha Plant Cove, I would just make the underwater sections more visually distinct to each other. I don't have any idea why this course needed to be a section course, because while there is a bit of variety in environments, this would have all fit into a 3-lap course easily, and I just don't see the point of expanding it to a section course when all the interesting bits have dull underwater reef sections in abundance between them. As it is though, I can't change that it's a section course, so the realistic solution here is just to make those parts more diverse. Madrid Drive is brimming with variety, and it never feels boring, so my only complaint is about the square section, which sometimes feels a bit awkward to turn in, so I maybe would have made it slightly bigger just to allow it to feel more natural to race in. My biggest qualm with Rosalina's Ice World is probably the underwater section, which feels almost copy-pasted from Sherbet Land and Piranha Plant Cove and so many others. There's a real lack of Galaxy influence on a course that's meant to be based on Rosalina and the Comet Observatory, so I'd maybe have tried to theme this course to somewhat reference one of the galaxies from the game, or, at the very least, just make it visually distinct to all the other similar examples of underwater sections. I know this came before any of the other examples, but this feels like the one with the most scope to actually change it. The change I would make to SNES Bowser Castle 3 would be to not have it in the game, and instead have the phenomenal tour version of GBA Bowser Castle 4 in its place. Not that it's a bad course. Oh no, it's wonderful. I just really wanted GBA Bowser Castle in this game. So badly. Short of that though, the thwomps here feel almost over-textured to a distracting degree. I get that they're made of rock, but the texturing is just too much, so I'd probably tone it down a bit. They actually look like they're textured differently from the ones in Thwomp Ruins, so I'd probably have them line up a bit more with those. And finally, Wii Rainbow Road. This remake is mind-bogglingly good, and my only issue has always been the fact that the waving bridge in the original started relatively gentle and got more aggressive with time, something that doesn't seem to happen in this version, or at least it starts off much more violent and so it doesn't feel as impactful. So I would make the waves line up better with the original version. This was not easy, and some of these changes took a lot of thought to come to, but I think there are some that are in dire need of a makeover. Do I think we'll ever see this? No, probably not, but it's nice to dream.